You know, if I were to summarize the Vineyard in 2 words, it would be changed lives. That's what the Vineyard is all about. We're not about money. We're not about bigness. We're not about looking the best or the fanciest. We're about changed lives. And every week here, there are changed lives because that's what God is in the business of doing. But have you ever noticed that some people's lives never seem to change? You know, I've only been to one high school reunion in my life. It was my 20-year reunion. And because I actually grew up and went to high school near Chicago, that was the first time that I had been back there in 20 years. And so I hadn't seen any of these people at all. And I was amazed at how little many of them had changed. You know, they had simply gained weight, lost hair, got a different job, but otherwise they were in the same rut as 20 years earlier. But actually, I think all of us need to look in the mirror because many of us keep doing the same things over and over and over, year after year, don't we? And often we want to change, but we feel like we can't, and eventually it becomes such an ingrained habit that, you know, we start to assume we could never change, and it's just who we are, and then we don't even try to change anymore. But that's not how God wants it to be in our lives. So take a second to ask yourself the question, how have I changed in the last year? How have I changed in the last 2 years or 5 years? How have I changed? Have I grown? Have I let God change my life? Or am I kind of treading water and wasting time? Let's look at a story this morning from somebody in the Bible who needed to change and then did change. It's in Genesis chapter 32. This is a story about the time when Jacob was getting ready to meet his brother Esau, whom he had swindled out of his inheritance. And so Jacob is scared to death because he knows that he stabbed Esau in the back, and now Esau probably wants to kill him. And then he hears that Esau is coming with an army of 400 men. So he quickly makes some arrangements to try and protect his family. He's still really worried and upset, what is going to happen to me? And then we pick it up in verse 3 of chapter 32. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called that place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. When God wants to change us, he takes you through 4 steps that we can see in the story. And when you understand these steps, then life makes a lot more sense. The first one that God takes you through when he wants to change you is a crisis. And in fact, maybe you're in a crisis this morning. That is not such a bad thing. It just means that God is getting ready to make a change in your life. And I'm going to say something that might surprise you, but your biggest battle in life is not your financial battles. Your biggest battle in life is not your physical health. Your biggest battle is not your relationship battle with somebody else, husband or wife or whoever. It's not your career or dealing with your past. Your biggest battle in life is with God. Now you might say, "Well, Ken, I'm not battling with God. I love God. I want to serve him." But unless you are already perfect, unless you never ever sin, you and I and all of us do struggle with God, whether you realize it or not. Ultimately, the struggle is over who's going to control my life. I want to be in control, and God wants to be in control. And there's a battle going on. That's what a crisis really is when we struggle with God. Now, it's not immediately obvious in the story who the man really was that Jacob was wrestling with, but the Bible makes it clear that it was either God in man's form or an angel wrestling for God. Because in verse 30, right after the wrestling match, Jacob says, I saw God face to face. And so this was not just some ordinary man. In addition, Hosea 12:3 tells us about Jacob. Before Jacob was born, he struggled with his brother. When he became a man, he even fought with God. You see, all his life, Jacob had struggled with his brother, but his biggest battle was really with God. I want you to think of your biggest conflict right now. The biggest problem you've got right now probably comes to your mind very quickly. Regardless of what that problem is, I can tell you two things about it. It all boils down to these two issues. One, will I obey God in that situation and do the right thing that he wants me to do, whether I like it or not? And then second, will I trust God in that situation to help me handle it? It doesn't really matter what your problem is, whether it's financial or health issues or relational or social, career-wise. No matter what the problem is, it really comes down to a struggle with God over, first, am I going to do the right thing and obey God in this situation? And second, am I going to trust God to help me with it? You see, your biggest problem is not really your problem. Your biggest problem is really whether you will obey and trust God in whatever situation you're facing. And the root of all your problems is your struggle with God, because you want to be in control and God wants to be in control. And so God often brings it to a boiling point. He allows a crisis because he wants us to change. And so Jacob has a wrestling match with God. Now, what's the objective of wrestling? And I am not talking about like wrestling on TV. I'm talking about real wrestling, right? I used to be a wrestler in high school. Believe it or not, I used to wrestle in the 112-pound weight class. That's when I was a freshman and sophomore. I was really skinny back then. But the real objective in wrestling is to pin the other guy's shoulders to the mat for 3 seconds or more, right? And so it's really about making the other person submit. When they are pinned to the mat, they can't move, and so they are submitting to my control. I had a roommate in Navy flight school named Gino. He ended up being the best man at my wedding. And in fact, I put a picture on the next slide here. Gino is the guy standing next to me there. He's my best man. And Gino and I had both just finished the Naval Academy. We're both in flight training school in Pensacola. And at the Naval Academy, both of us were athletes. Gino was one of the top tennis players on the varsity team. I was on the rowing team. And so we were both athletes, both in good shape. But Gino was bigger than me. He was like 6'1", 190 pounds, so he had about 30 pounds on me. Plus, he was really good looking, and he always had girls flocking around him, which kind of aggravated me. This was long before I met Kathy, but he was a pretty nice guy despite all that. So I remember one summer day we were goofing around like 23-year-olds do, and we started arguing about who's the better athlete. And so then I told him I could out-wrestle him. And Gino says, no way. He did not believe me because he's bigger than me, right? And now you have to remember, Gino was a tennis player. And how many muscles do you have to hit around a little tennis ball, right? You know, and I was on the rowing team. He knew that. But I don't think he really knew that I was on the wrestling team in high school. And so we went out on the grass in the backyard, and it took me less than a minute to pin Gino. I didn't even have to work that hard. And I would not let him up until he said that I was number one. And he did not want to say it. He was resisting, but I wasn't going to let him go. And so finally he said, okay, I admit it, Ken, you're number one. And then I still kept him pinned for a little while longer because I was just kind of enjoying it. And, you know, I think maybe I was hoping that some of his girlfriends would stop by and see me manhandling him, but that didn't happen. But the point is, Gino had to submit because I was in control. All your life, you have been in a battle with God. You may not realize it, maybe it's not intentional, but you've been wrestling with him over who's going to be in control in your life. Who's going to be number one? Are you going to call the shots? Or is God going to call the shots in your life? You've been struggling with God, and that is the root of every one of your problems, not fully trusting or fully obeying And in fact, some of you are struggling with God in some area right now. He's allowed a crisis to come into your life. Maybe you feel like you're backed in the corner and you're asking God, why are you letting this happen? God often allows a crisis into our life to get our attention. It's like a telephone call from heaven. Now, when some of us hit one of those crises, we just continue to ignore God. We just refuse to listen to him, and so we just bounce from one crisis to another in life, never learning anything, never changing our lives. But if you listen and respond to God, then you go to the next step, which is a commitment. I make a decision that my life needs to change. My faith needs to grow. My obedience and my trust needs to grow. I make a commitment, and then I refuse to let go of that commitment, and I say, I am sticking with this until I see some results. Let's watch a short video.
When I got to the NFL, I walked into a hotel room with some guys on the team. I was a rookie, and it was one of those peer pressure things, fitting in, and it was about 6 guys in the hotel room. I didn't know what we were going in there for, and they just pulled out cocaine. I was like, oh man. I saw everybody else doing it, and I said, well, this can't be that bad. I knew it was wrong, and I knew it was dangerous, but I lived on the edge. One day, my buddy took me to a crack house, and I said, I want to go watch the guy make crack. So I went into this bathroom, and I sat in this little tiny bathroom, and there was this guy in there with a white tank top, shriveled up, skinny. He was like a skeleton. And I remember looking at him going, man, that pitiful guy. This drugs is killing him. And then I looked in the mirror, and God said, what about you? He was in your seat not that long ago. And my buddy opened up the door, and he gave the crack to the drug dealer and my buddy stood this far away from me and smoked crack. And I remember his eyes just kind of rolling back into his head, and I thought he was gonna die right in front of me. And he asked me, did I want some? And I said, nah. And he said, you're strong. I said, no, I'm scared. I'm not strong, I'm scared. That was one of the wake-up calls for me, because I went into the other room by myself in this dark room and did cocaine by myself, and it's like, what am I doing? I'm in the NFL, I'm living my dream, and I'm destroying it. And I would look myself in the mirror and audibly say, don't put the powder in your nose. I would say those words to myself in the mirror, and then I would put the powder in my nose. And to think that I couldn't stop, how far is this gonna take me, and what is gonna happen to me? I got to a point where I realized that I was throwing away the best opportunity I had. And I just woke up and said, I can't do this anymore. And I just kept saying, God, one more day. One more day, I want to party. One more. There's gonna be that party. There's gonna be that experience that's gonna make me fulfilled and make me happy. And every day I was like, I just gotta hold out for that. And it never came. And there were some guys on my team who shared the gospel with me. So April 12th, 1984, 5 o'clock in the morning, I had been up all night, and I said, I'm done. I'm gonna give God the commitment I've given football, the commitment I've given drugs, the commitment I've given fun. I'm gonna give God that commitment. And I said, I'm gonna give my life to you today. I had to come to a point where I had to make a decision that I was gonna be committed to doing the right thing and following Jesus. And I did.
When you're in a crisis and you know that something needs to change and you need to make the commitment, then press on until you see the victory. Do not back down. Do not stop short of the goal. Do not give up. You see, if you give up, you miss the blessing. Jacob knew that. In verse 26 we read, then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, we don't know if Jacob knew at the time that this was God that he's wrestling with. He did know it later. But somehow he figured out that the guy he's wrestling with was more powerful than him and had the potential to bless him. And so he was not going to let go. He said, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. Now, obviously, because this was either God or an angel wrestling with him, God could have overpowered him and ended the thing instantly, right? And so you have to ask yourself, why did God let this struggle go on all night long? And here's the lesson. When God allows a crisis into our life, he doesn't solve it instantly. He lets it go on for a while. Why? Because he wants to find out if you really mean business, if you really want to be blessed, if you really want to grow, if you really want to get something out of this. Is it just a whim or a passing thing, or is it a deep desire in your life? Have you ever asked the question, well, why doesn't God answer my prayers like instantly? Well, there's a couple reasons. Because if he did, first of all, you'd be a spoiled brat. You'd be like, you remember the story of Midas where everything he touched turns to gold, and it ruined his life, right? And so if God answered your prayers immediately, you'd start treating him like a big vending machine rather than your Father in heaven. But another reason is you wouldn't grow if God bailed you out instantly. For example, you ever heard anybody say, well, I'm praying for a financial miracle. I am so deep in debt. I need a financial miracle. And I want to say, well, did you get yourself into debt by a miracle? No, you worked hard at it. You made foolish decisions. You spent more money than you made. You didn't save for the crises that inevitably come along. You didn't use your money wisely. You got in debt all by yourself. So why should God just bail you out instantly with some financial miracle? And what would happen if God did that? If he just instantly bailed you out, paid off all your debt, you know what would happen? You would go out and you would overspend again. Because you'd figure out, oh, this is a good deal. I can just, waste all my money, spend it all, and God's going to bail me out, and so I'll go do it again. You would learn no character, no discipline, no commitment, no money management, no wisdom. And so God is not going to do that. He's not going to bail you out of debt, and he will help you to get out of debt by helping you to make wise choices one day at a time. But he's not going to do it instantly. Otherwise, you don't learn anything. And you would go right back to the same pattern again. And so the miracle that God does in your life will be a process involving commitment and involving time. Galatians 6:9, it says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest, if what? If we do not give up. If you're in some kind of crisis right now, do not give up. Hang in there. Keep it up. Don't try to escape, but stick with it. Because the problems that you have in your life, your faults and your bad habits, you didn't get those overnight. You worked for years to get those into your life. You have ingrained patterns and insecurities, wrong ways of responding, wrong habits, and you developed those over many years. And so God isn't going to remove them all at once. It's kind of like peeling an onion. It happens one layer at a time. And that leads to the next stage in how God changes you. First is the crisis, when we struggle with God. Then there's the commitment, where I say, I am not going to let go. I'm going to stick with this until I get blessed. And then third is a confession. At this stage, I admit that I am the problem. We stop blaming other people, and we admit, I am the problem in my life. And until you get this, there is no lasting change. In verse 27, the man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Now, this is a strange request, because God obviously already knew Jacob's name, right? And so why does he ask him his name? It's not because God needed to know. It's because Jacob needed to own up to who he was. You see, in ancient cultures, you're often named for your character, what you really were. And Jacob's name means grasper or deceiver. And Jacob lived up to that name. He deceived everybody. He lied to his dad, who was going blind and didn't know the difference. He cheated his brother out of his inheritance. He used his father-in-law. He was a real manipulator. And so when God asks him, what is your name? And Jacob tells him, my name is Deceiver. He's telling the truth. He's owning up to what he really is. Now, let's all think for a second. What if people were to name you for your greatest character fault. Now, thank goodness they don't do that nowadays, right? But if we did, what would be your name? Oh, hi, my name is greedy. My name is bitter, or uncontrollable temper, or my name is lustful, manipulator. Can you just imagine being named that way? You know, my name is fearful. I'm depressed. My name is gossip. Now, that would not be a good thing. But what would be your name? Here's the point. I will never be able to change until I honestly admit my sin, admit my weakness, admit my faults, admit my character defect that needs to change. And that's the reason why 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous are so successful. At every meeting, you admit your problem. I'm an alcoholic. It's part of the deal. All of us need to do that in the area of our life that God wants to change. We need to admit it. And that is the most difficult part of change, very honestly. But now you come to the good part. The fourth stage in God's process of change is conversion. In a conversion, we're given a new identity. And let me tell you, that new identity from God is really, really good. Let's watch another video.
I get to college and, I've been cleaned up my act, but the fruit of my life still isn't changed. I get back and all of a sudden I'm at this college and now I'm a small fish in a big pond. So I feel like I gotta prove myself all over again. So I go back to drinking, I go back to smoking, I go back to partying, and I land myself in jail. We stealing groceries out of Walmart. And I just remember looking around and like, whatever I'm trying to do in my life, it isn't working. I had a chance to make it out, and now my coach can take my scholarship and I'd be sent back home. And I messed up my opportunity before I even played a snap on the field. Fortunately, the coach did not kick me off the team. He gave me another chance, because a little while later, our team chaplain, who I've been going to Bible studies with, he started to spend time with me in the Word. He was talking about, these radical ideas that I had never even thought about. And then he started to show me in the Bible that matched exactly what he was saying. And I never had looked at the Bible in that light. A good tree can't bear bad fruit, and a bad tree can't bear good fruit. And he was talking about, this is talking about your heart. So my whole theory with God was, at the end of the day, God, I got a good heart. Well, this was showing me that I had a bad heart, because nothing but bad fruit was coming from my life. But then he told me something that was reassuring and encouraging. He said, God will take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And that night I went home and I was scared and I just prayed. It was the most sincere prayer I'd ever prayed. I said, God, I need a new heart. That's all I said. God, I need a new heart. And the next day I was hoping that everything would change. I woke up, and by the end of the day I was doing a lot of the same stuff I had been doing. And I went to him and I was like, man, you said that God would give me a new heart if I asked. He said, if you ask for a new heart, God will honor it and God will give it to you. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but he's gonna give it to you. The message started to resonate, and I started to understand why Jesus had to die on the cross. He had to pay for those sins, and until we get a new heart, we can't fix what's coming out of us, and that God wants to come inside of us and clean us so that he can draw us back to himself. And it was like he was taking the scales off my eyes. At that moment, he removed the taste of alcohol from my mouth. He didn't remove marijuana and sex right then, but I said, God, you're the Lord of my life, and I'm gonna choose to serve you. When you wanna move these things, you will. And he did. A little bit later, he removed marijuana, and then I was in an impure relationship for 5 years. God broke it. He was like, it's time to get out of this. And I got out of that relationship. For 2 years, I walked in purity. I dated my wife, and then we were married a year and a half later. And that was the first time I'd ever did a relationship the right way. And to say that I've done that now and then look at the benefits of a blessed relationship and our marriage of after 4 years and our beautiful children, just to see that the fruit that's come from it, you just understand God is a God of order, and when we do things in his order, he can bless them more. I let go and I said, God, I'm trusting you. I don't know where you're gonna take me. And he's brought me closer and closer to him.
Genesis 32:28. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Then he blessed him there. So the transformation of Jacob begins. And notice the three things that happen. Number one, he gets a brand new identity. God says, your name was Jacob, or deceiver, But that's the old you. We're not going to call you that anymore. We're going to change your name. We're going to call you Israel, which means prince with God. Wow, that is a little bit different identity from deceiver. And God says, I know you've blown it. I know you've been a manipulator. You've been Jacob, deceiver. But I see in you prince. That's your new identity. You're going to be named Israel. Because beneath all of your junk, beneath all your hang-ups and insecurities and all the stuff that you don't want anybody else to know about, I see prince. God would say that to some of you this morning who maybe don't really believe it. But beneath all of your problems and faults, I see princess or prince. Beneath all the sins, all the areas you've messed up, I see your potential. I see that you can be something great. You can be what I made you to be. Not what you've been in the past, but what I made you to be if you just own up and admit who you are. And so we confess it, and then God says, now we're going to give you a new identity. And this morning, God wants to give you a new identity, a new name, so that he can make something great of your life. He gives you a new identity, and then the next step is he blesses you. In verse 29, it says, then he blessed him there. If you want God's blessing, you got to take the steps. God gave Jacob new identity and new blessing, and then the third thing God did is he gave Jacob a reminder of his presence, of his experience, so that he would never forget what happened. God gave him a limp. In verse 31, it says, the sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. You see, when you really meet God, really experience God, you will never walk the same again. Because you cannot meet somebody as great and powerful as God and just stay the same. You can't do it. If you meet God, you start to walk differently. And Jacob leaves this situation both stronger and weaker. He's stronger because he's not the same person anymore. There's been a conversion. But he's weaker because now he's going to have to depend on God for his daily walk. I'd like the worship band to come up, and we're going to close in a minute. As they come up, let me kind of summarize what we've said today. God does his deepest work in your life when he deals with your identity, the way you see yourself, your self-perception, because that affects everything else in your life. Jacob had to quit seeing himself as a deceiver and start seeing himself as a prince. So God does his deepest changes in your life by changing the way you see yourself. He says, let me show you how I see you. Let me change your name. I see you as prince or princess. You're the child of a king. And when you see yourself the way God sees you, through eyes of unconditional love, it's going to change your life. You'll start acting a whole new way because you don't have to stay the same. Let's stand for prayer. And let's bow together. And I'd like to close with just a few personal questions. So with your head bowed, just think about these questions for a moment. Number one, in what area are you struggling with God right now? Where do you know the right thing to do in your life, but maybe you've just been ignoring God about it, or you're wrestling with God on it? Next, what do you need to admit about yourself? What truth about yourself do you need to face up to? And third, will you let Christ give you a new identity? God sees underneath all the baggage, and he sees a prince or a princess in his kingdom, because he knows you don't have to stay the same. Now let's all of us just say yes to God right now. In your heart, you can say it, he'll hear you, but say yes to letting him be in control. No more wrestling with him. Just say this with me in your heart. Yes, Jesus, I want you to be in control. I don't want to be the same anymore. I want to change. I want to follow you from this day forward. Today, I'm stepping across the line and saying yes to you.